So looking back, looking forward, we could try start by throwing pebbles on the table. Pebbles being like topic names, like and what they might contain can be opened later. Like from my side, I know that others have stuff, but I'll throw quickly. I have, of course, the Think Well, which was the event in Berlin, which was also a topic we visited a couple of times, uh, but also happened uh, uh, last weekend. That's one. Then I have the topic of the setting, which was visited in the um, EXA events, but also is something that was born in XORG, which was also mentioned, by the way, in that session, as is proper. And of course, we could talk about um, Oxford and things that happened there. And there are other things in the EXA event. So those are my pebbles. So think well, setting and the rest of the EXA event, Oxford, especially now Eva is gracing us with your presence. Anybody else want to throw some pebbles on the table?
Just want to acknowledge that those pebbles were pebbles to the back, so we might as well throw some pebbles to the future and maybe see what happens then.
Yeah, this is like, I was thinking that there are some like these pebbles to the back produce yarns to the future. Maybe I should have called them like, like bundles of thread. Anyway, like, but if one can throw pebbles or bundles of thread
I've got both kinds of pebbles.
What, sorry?
We got both kinds of pebbles, one of each.
Yes.
Throw them out there. So one is kind of reaching back all the way back to September, I guess. Just remembering fondly, our time together and the specific instance where we were kind of faking a game into reality. You know, we're kind of naming things, and it kind of similar to your technique of just kind of taking objects in situ, making relations between them and so on. That there was this added twist that was really fun.
This was the walk that turned into a game, ending up in this church. Yes.
Also, yeah, but also on the table one night. I think we were up and I don't know when. Yeah.
Yes. On the slow side of the horse, on the fast side of the horse.
Yeah. The tarot cards and yeah.
Yeah, at some point, but not now, we should tell Eva about all the things we've done around tarots, but that's maybe for later. But
I have an extremely decadent picture of that table, which just brings me so fond memories of it, but it just cannot capture the essence of what was happening, right? Just looks like a messy table. So yeah, I have to deal with the incoherence between my memory and the image.
Yeah, it was the hexagon, like the hexagon stickers that kind of led to the whole thing.
Yeah. It was this sort of shape of hexagons and starting to build it, and then kind of transitioning semi-smoothly into also building a game on it. Yeah. So that's a good pebble bundle of yarn. The metaphors are welcome. Anybody else?
The one for the future is just this, the Game Changers. We're playing in November in Ljubljana. Pekka will be there as well, and I also asked Felix to be there from the Commons Hub as the 6th player. Yeah, it's gonna be pretty sweet, I think. Also meeting with the players next week, doing some play testing. And also it seems in January or February, I'll be in Berlin to organize something with Supermarkt and a few other organizations. So it could be a nice opportunity to, meet up, or at least some XORGians. And
that would be splendid. We can think about how to congeal towards that. If we can manage that, but that would be great. So now we have several pebbles on the table, but the table is larger because it's essentially infinite because it's imaginary. So anybody else wants to throw some other pebbles on the table?
I might throw a pebble into the future as maybe a couple of pebbles into the future. One pebble into the future is closer interaction with the brother Exa that was discussed today. We might negotiate how that looks for us. What can we provide? How do we want to take part more closely? If that's even desirable, maybe it's not, but putting that pebble. And the other pebble, I guess, is retaking the cards, sort of like just working on the cards. We had some very nice conversations now about the definition of some oxels, as particularly the definition of oxel, how we could make the definition so it's a game in itself, so that you understand what it is by playing it.
Are you referring to the conversation we had in the aforementioned moose or moss? Yes, that was actually on my list of because we had a good conversation of how to unite many of these things like oxel and cards, which might actually be good to pull our memories from it. And anything else? There are still empty slots in the horizon of the table, if needed. Of course, time is our enemy, but we'll see what we do with the time and as we fight it. As always.
I mean, from my end, I had the pleasure, but then it was a very kind of singular pleasure of joining for the first Zoom of the EXA Labs, kind of the opening session there, and I found it super interesting, and I would just be extremely curious to hear more about it, and yeah, maybe that's it's not really a pebble, it's just like pointing at one, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was also the session with the settings and that then this sort of also acknowledgement of the background development of XORG and continuous like possibility of that development, which has been talked about. So that's a lot of pebbles. Anybody else?
I throw one pebble on exactly the same statement because I try to sneak in and find my way in here as well and see where I end up.
Mm-hmm. So you throw it exactly into the same as which?
Martin was your name, right?
Martin. So maybe just like an expansion of the pebble.
Yes, exactly, like an explorational pebble. Let's put it like that.
In the metaphor of the yarn, it could be that you threw a similar colored bundle of yarn. So even though they're separate, they could be knotted together and compounded. I think mixing metaphors is underrated. Sometimes it's useful.
Or a pebble with the same direction thrown in, or something like that.
Yeah. Pebble that slots into the other pebble. All right. But okay, we have all of these things. Where would you like to start? Like this is not some kind of voting situation, but if anybody would propose where to start, which pebble to pick first, which ball of yarn to unravel.
we could talk a bit about the EXA sessions, just because the pebble got, or the yarn got a bit bigger.
Mhm.
I could say it was great. It was really, really nice. A lot of like warm energy, very much in the CCG spirit. A lot of people from CCG were there as well. There was excitement, there was conversations, there was tension, there was laughter, cry. Like it was really, yeah, really emotional and nice. In terms of the work being presented, it's like, it's amazing. I mean, this protocol they've been working on for what, Pekko, 6 years? Something like that, no? I
Too
mean,
long.
you could trace it even further back, I imagine, but like formally this paper around 6 years. And I don't know, because I've been following sort of the development, and it's been like almost ready since maybe 2019 or 20. I remember like, okay, this is almost done, this is almost ready to be published, and it just hasn't, right? So I'm just like, I don't know, is this really now that it's being ready, or is this just a continuation of the almost readiness?
I would just note that I don't think you've ever heard me say that it's almost ready.
I guess not. I guess I
yeah.
haven't heard you, but I sort of
I
like,
don't think, because I'm careful with my words in these kind of things, or in
yeah.
other kinds of things as well. Like, just to say that,
And
maybe
it's clear
that's
that they haven't been careful, because it's been almost ready for so long, right? But it
yeah.
looks almost ready to me from my tourist perspective. It looks basically ready.
We'll see. Like, it's like, I would like, maybe the one thing I would like to say to this, like EXA, I think, has for a long time, for a while, I think, naturally tended to be a network, and this network, but it wasn't always such in structure. Now it's kind of growing to be such. But this also means, like, and this may be now, I'm thinking them as yarns, and I'm touching this on Pablo's yarn of the kind of brotherly relations to EXA. Question is that, for me, it's like a potential network still learning to be a network. But part of this being a network is also like how different things can grow and different areas can grow. Because I do think, like, for both economy and organization, the current situation is it can contain like general models, but I do think it's much more about diversity. It's about building a garden of new approaches in a situation where nobody knows where things are actually going, which is typical for things that are taking baby steps, like culturally speaking. So in this sense, like, all of these directions, including what is the DSP protocol side or the economic paper, which by the way is slightly different, and other things are, including the things that we develop, are. I mean, we have the freedom. Actually, we are not in a shackle. That's but we have a free. We are in association. That's how I would put it, and that's how it has been put. But we, like, in terms of, if it turns into a network, it's also a possibility to respect everybody's work in itself. And there's always been this tension of like how everybody supports that something is coming out, which they should, but also there's like how it's not about like people gathering under one flag carrying that to the end, and that is important, because I think one flag is something that you might also sink under, like, just because it's just one flag. It might have many good ideas, but the world is a whimsical beast. So in this sense, like, just I look at it as kind of a diversity, and look at it like, not that something you have to belong to, but you have an association to, you can relate to, also with your work. That's what I would say. Mm. Mm. But any other particulars you would like to pick from EXA events
I mean, I guess that was a very good description of the network relation and how it's sort of like up to us to foster that relation as much as we want, and like to make it more present or less present depending on each one of us, and us as a network in itself, or as a tentacle as we refer to. But I do think there was a realization, at least I saw that in Jorge, the main developer of the protocol, in the capacity of play to express the language they're using and the affordances they're bringing for the creation of alternative valuations. So I do see like a sliver of opportunity that maybe wasn't clear to them before, or like it was not clear how deep that could go. And that's exciting as a prospect. So I'm just wondering how much we should sort of like hold that as a guidance, because it can also very much steer our direction. So I would be just cautious of its power and yeah, decide with caution how to move forward regarding that possibility. Yeah, that's it.
Well, it's a possibility I would visit when, like maybe one can visit it during the development, but also it's a possibility to visit when something becomes more realizable. There are other possibilities. Like, for example, in this network, there's also XLabs, which was the kind of first session, opening session was parts of that. But XLabs is also technologically agnostic, that it's not tied to any protocol to explore the space in the more wider sense. And this is partly also like because, you know, like even if you make what you think is the best board game ever, or just among them, nobody in the board game world thinks that, okay, now every board game after this will be designed after this. It will be a rather bleak picture. And I would say that the same is true of economy, which is not an argument against or for models, but it's rather argument for diversity. That and like I think we're culturally not yet at the point of realizing that economically. And like for XLabs, for example, many of the forms have required taking different kinds of approaches which necessarily don't fit under DSP, because that allows to explore the space in a more wider fashion. And this is important. Like I do think, like especially from the learnings of being in crypto like too long a time, like there was this time of everybody telling their world vision, world computers and whatnot. But I do think that was a mistake, or is not fitting into how things are. It's really about this sort of finding diverse forms, and some of those is good to find lightly. Some of those are good to find experimentally. Some of those are good to find in more pragmatic fashion. But nevertheless, like, so we can do that, but it's like I would not take it as a limitation. Like even XLabs doesn't. So. But any other
I think that's
pieces?
good.
Yeah, fragments from the. But any other fragments from the exo sessions?
I mean, it's curious because Pekko pulled out the crazy stunt of being in two places at once, so that was impressive. So I would also like to hear about what your omnipresence allowed you to do in the other space you were in. But from the EXA sessions, I think that was a good summary. I mean, we can go deeper into it, but I think for now that's good. Maybe just go ahead.
Yeah, I would. Can you hear me? I changed source. There was one thing that I found super interesting in this one session that I could attend, and I don't know if this is now the moment to go deeper into. I would certainly like, even in another setting, to go deeper into this. But that was this idea of long volatility, and since I was not there for the rest of the days, I don't know how central that idea was to anything that followed. I also did not exactly understand if the gathering of kind of thoughts was more like a symposium type of thing, so everybody brought a bit, or if there was kind of more core points to it. But like from Jorge's presentation, where that came from, I found that extremely intriguing, and I would like to hear, talk, think more about it today or at another point.
Yeah, in terms of where the long volatility came from, there is so like I said, it's a network, and there is the node of the old Robin Hood, which is not the big Robin Hood, which was the organization that existed before EXA, but kind of was the birthing point for EXA. And this long volatility is a kind of thematic for its rejuvenation, which is then connected to this EXA Labs. Or one of the things connected to EXA Labs is to wake that up. And this is why that was in that session. It's not the only thing, even kind of the largest thing in EXA Labs, but it was a thing we haven't really talked about. So we wanted to open that and test that out. And it also contains this setting idea, which is like particular implementation of this idea, which, as said in the sessions, came from this sort of XORG discussions. And this is also like setting as a cultural form, like that, which is actually not that unusual, because we are more and more in settings, whether they are Marvels or Star Wars or but also like things like, of course, Game of Thrones, etc., are more and more thinking of themselves as settings there, which means that particular media forms are not the thing in itself, but rather they stem from a larger pool, which is more systematic and networked. But then that has a nature. So we are more and more actually under where, roughly speaking, what is media is not a book or a film, but rather there is this larger media which is underneath the surfacings, like books or movies or whatever, or texts or pictures, like really any form. So how do we actually kind of tackle that cultural form, like what it is as an art form? All of these kind of questions is kind of where those thoughts stem about, and also like how to structure those, which you can take a lot of things from games, because games are probably the most developed in terms of the setting side in itself. And then in terms of DSP, just shortly, like so DSP is a mixture of like many EXA ideas. There is like Jorge's long-term background in a kind of network protocol. There is the offers from my side, which like this is now turned into an offer protocol, essentially, like which is a change in the last couple of years, which has led to this DSP, and then forming a certain kind of economic basis from that. So that's a longer conversation in terms of what are the kind of possibilities of functioning, what are the structures, strengths and weaknesses of that structure itself. But maybe that's for another time to visit. So that's maybe like a summary from shining a bit of light to all of this. No, we cannot hear you again.
Ah,
No.
check. Talk.
Yes.
Okay. I missed both the moment in the EXA sessions, or then also today where DSB was again defined. What was it? Could you just repeat?
No, this was Jorge's talk.
Oh, so like, but what does it translate to again, DSB?
So, like the whole structure has actually several contentious translations being currently in the talks, but I don't actually know which he used because I couldn't be in the session given the double booking. But yeah, so let me check back on that. What is the kind of decision on this naming? I don't know if it will stand as DSB in the end. Also, maybe a working title. But that
I think they're using generally ESP as Economic Space Protocol, and then inside of the ESP there's different parts. One of them is like a distributed spaces protocol, distributed
ESP,
credit protocol, distributed something else protocol. I might have my book with some of them, but there's the ESP and then a bunch of distributed data structures inside of it that are able to communicate with one another in particular ways.
But this is telling you also how things appear solid on the outside, like everything was DSP to a recent point. And now ESP is a naming for the whole, and that has been recently put on the table and was presented there. Expect that the possibility that it can still change as things go. Also, so that's, but essentially, like just to your question of what was that talk, that was on the topic it was about.
I have some of the definitions here if we can look at them fast. So it's the ESP, Economic Space Protocol, then there's the Distributed Stake Protocol, the Distributed Credit Protocol, and the Distributed Exchange Protocol. Then below there's the Distributing Accounting Protocol. Then below one that I don't remember the name of. And then below there's the Distributed Network Protocol. And there you can build notions of agent, offers, networks, super interesting stuff. This I think we should mention because it's relevant to XORG. One very beautiful thing about the thing they're building is that the protocol itself is distributed. And what I mean with that is that you can reconfigure the protocol through the protocol itself. So it has this notion of like what we've talked about, the game, the meta game, redefine the rules, play them, go back to a meta space, play those rules, like the co-creation of language in a space of play, that's expressed there as well. So yeah, that was really profound.
Now that's also a kind of still point under talks because, I mean, this is getting nerdy protocol-wise, but I'll make a comparison with smart contracts. Like smart contracts is like, we free everything. Now you can create anything in a blockchain. And everybody goes, wow. Like now this creation opens up. And we can redefine, everyone forms their own protocol. So there was a loop of that already in the smart contracts talks, especially around Ethereum. But then the question becomes, if everybody defines their own, do you have essentially a chaotic space? That every solution is separate, there is actually no communication surfaces, and what is the economy then missing? And because then kind of structuration that also protocols do is partly built by like pre-understanding forms, like how forms understand other forms. So there is a price to freedom, and how much of that freedom should be given is actually a big practical question. So things like might sound like, okay, you just open up this, but you know, like on a high level, you could say you just make everything programmable and everybody creates their own economics. This is of course not DSP, ESP, etc. But just to paint the picture, that would be the widest range of possibility. But why isn't the proposal that would work? It's precisely because this sort of chaotic space that it would create, and there would be no economy at all. Or very little, let's say. So yeah, like but it's something to visit in some point. Like there are these protocols. There's also like in this network, there are also other models, and maybe that would be some topic to visit at some point to compare the different models in EXA. But that's a longer topic maybe than today, or is a longer topic than today. But yes, so but yeah, so that was the EXA sessions. Also now included the setting, but maybe the practical thing I'd say about that, like figuring out the setting is one possibility also for us, like because I mean it came from here, as mentioned also in the session. So like Robinhood is a particular take on it, but like it's early in this development, like particularly also the setting structure development. So that's a possibility.
I'm thinking that we could map some of our XORG concepts to the concepts in the ESP. That could be interesting. Like, for example, the scenes and the spaces could be mapped together, and therefore the settings could be mapped to the networks. But since it has like this more of a narrative flair to it, I think that could be really interesting when the time is right for EXA to have a language around articulating stories around the capabilities of the protocol through the settings framework. So yeah, maybe a more thorough mapping of concepts could be useful. And maybe that could also, I'm like going, this pebble is like as far as I can throw, could become useful for our cards in terms of operational capacities within the ESP. Yeah, imagine some of the cards can be articulated within the language of the protocol. That could be really interesting.
Yeah, potentially, but that's maybe for another day, another topic. Like I said, this has been in talks. Maybe for me, like there are certain limits of the ESP which I don't yet agree with, and this is currently also like when you present the surface, you present it as a whole in a way, but it's there are things that I would like to reformulate, and it has gone through multiple reformulations in the last year, last 2 years, last 3 years. Take your pick, but yeah, that's something to visit. But maybe yeah, it's a complex topic for now. But we should give time for the other pebbles as well. Like, so there was the mention of the think well, but I've been talking a lot. So if somebody wants to touch upon another pebble, that would be also a good choice. I think
I would like to hear from Eva about the Oxford conference.
I mean, I think we can do that together. Pekko was there as well, because I'm very much in my like organizational perspective, and Pekko will bring hopefully the outside perspective of how it was perceived. I only can say how I was involved. Actually, I would like to hear Pekko first before I say my conclusions.
Is this the weight of meaning? Okay. What should I say? Like there was an interesting sense of colorfulness to the whole thing, which was really positive in the sense that there was like it was way more vivid than you could sense from a thing that has NFT in its title. Like there's a certain kind of quality to those, but this was much more varied in its speakers, particularly, but in some ways also maybe people themselves, like in a larger sense. And then that kind of formed, I think, interesting this sort of ecosystem of communication, which I liked. It was as often in conferences, there are these sort of quick sparks, like there's no long build-ups, but those are anyway hard in conferences. And so, but like the sort of sparks of surprise, I think, in terms of what kind of topics you ended up talking in, like in whatever forms those talks happen, from the front, so to speak, or in the middle, between people. So that's my start. And now I move it to you, because I cannot take all the weight. You have to carry some of this weight of expression.
I have one last question. What was one of these moments of spark for you?
Oh, now you're milking the expression. Like this is getting okay. So I would pick like it's personal, but I had actually a couple of interesting ones with Ruth from further field. Like, I often find that whatever the conference, it's the talks in the middle that happen that are kind of have this sort of liveliness, and this related to some of the topics from her talk, and it essentially concerned this sort of like we touch upon this, like how does organization become play, and then her way of looking at it, which was interesting to compare. And I picked this because it's a very XORGian communication as well, or at least in the themes. But it may be as an addition, because that's kind of a kind of small scale moment. I would pick, which might not be fair, but I think it was actually very interesting to bring this Christie's Ventures, which is a very capitalistic, cutthroat, in it for the money, as Christie's is towards the NFTs. But I really appreciated that person talking in the manner of everything being informed by money, and how they're making a complete mix-up, or just complete merging of economic value and artistic value in itself, and how that like in another conference this would have been filtered out. We don't want this kind of people, but for me it was actually a bright spot that happened, because it was part of the ecosystem. It's something that people can look away from, but it's there, and it brought a kind of like a color that needed to be in the ecosystem. So those are two picks. There could be others, but or there would be many others, but I'll pick those two. Is that enough milking? Like, it's turning cheese already. Like,
thank you. Yes. Yeah, I would describe it most probably in a very similar way. My personal intention with this entire event was to kind of break up these very academic structures, and like we described this metaphor in a different concept of in a different context of a diamond having like different facets, like depending on from which angle you look at it, you see different things. And this is like I heard that was how it was perceived, and that kind of makes me very satisfied that like it was possible to somehow break up this very like strong traditional structure that Oxford brings with it, and like kind of mixing or blurring the lines between what is an academic conference, or what is an academic discussion, what is an industry discussion, and like having that infused with this topic of like, interestingly enough, we barely used the word NFT, which was like a fantastic thing, because it's just a term that is so loaded, and I try to avoid that, and I'm very grateful that people around us also avoided it. And I also feel like this is how this entire discussion could evolve around DAOs, and just having a different focus. And that was the intention of the conference, and that was also kind of how I would reflect upon it. I also really appreciated this one guy you were referring to from Christie's, just like, especially what I said was like having these different facets, also having friction, which brings new perspectives and new findings. At the same time, the conference was about art, and in my personal opinion, the art wasn't that present. And this is something I don't regret it, but I missed it. Let's put it like that. And we had an artist talk, and I kind of was craving them actually going into like, okay, what does it mean doing art with a blockchain or on a blockchain and using the medium as like a way how it influences it. And that didn't happen. And this is something I don't know how it would have been possible to trigger that, but at the same time, interestingly enough, that makes me think about the type of art we're talking about. More than one artist mentioned for them it was super important to have this kind of artist talk and panel discussion just with other peers. So apparently for them it was very helpful, even though I realized it was just not me who was satisfied, but they were. I need some time to reflect on what that actually means or what my findings are, thinking about blockchain art and how to use it. That was.
Are there any recordings, Eva?
There will be, yeah.
And public,
yeah.
Yeah, great.
Mm-hmm.
I would be curious to watch. I will have to jump out unceremoniously, but please finish. Okay, then I will see you soon, hopefully. I will also be watching this recording, so
yeah,
lots of recordings to watch.
Yeah, also like maybe a good tip on the recording. Like I think we should visit the Thinkwell. There was a lot of things happening there, but maybe Pablo, you can see that in the recording. That's maybe up and coming, but yes. And we have to think about how do we give time for the bunch of pebbles that we have on the table, but among them, like
yeah, sorry that the exa pebble became so huge. Maybe it shouldn't have, but yeah, I'm partially to blame for that. Okay, see you.
Yeah, see you.
See you, Pablo.
I think from Oxford and XORG, the one thing I would say, like, let's say from the background reads, just is that, and this is something that Pablo actually heard because, and Jakob, because they were in Berlin, like, the kind of direction that I was essentially outlining, I would say, in the end of that talk. There's much more underneath that. Like there is this sort of idea of how we have maybe misconceived what even an organization is, like that, like maybe it has a similar relation to media as games do, which would not be surprising, especially in an XOR context, which is this sort of like you play chess game outside in the rain, or the rain starts and then you stop the game and take a picture of the game board outside and you move it to a computer, which in itself being a normal moment, but that moment contains a lot of meaning, a lot of implications. And one of the implications is that the media wasn't actually the thing. It was the system, or to put it short, because this could be a long comment and I'm trying to squeeze it, like that it's able to transform into another media because the media is just a utility for it in a game. But what if we take the same principle for organizations? And there is a certain coherence that builds out of that, which is that why is it possible that this organization in the traditional sense has a great, like an important meeting in a cafe, maybe impromptu, or a beach, and then a napkin becomes a basis of a plan that is then later written to a proposal. Now, this is almost impossible in a traditional way of how we look at organizations to code in. It's like, why did the cafe suddenly become part of our organization and then completely disappear from it? But if we think of it in terms of this game structure, is that it's not actually about the place medium. It's much more about the system and the structure itself, and that system then occupies or even invades or takes over some kind of spaces and places, just like the chess game. We have a very different picture of the organization, the sort of system first kind of an approach, and that has a lot of implications. Like ultimately, like why don't we look like if you take Wikipedia, there is a Wikipedia organization that runs Wikipedia, and that's like, oh, that's an organization. But then there is Wikipedia itself, the website, and that organizes people. People have roles, they have editors and so on. Like this is actually doing exactly the same thing. So why is that not an organization? Why it's not considered in the same way? Because it's doing the same things. Now, if we start from the system, I think that is quite possible. But what does it mean for how do we conceive these systems and how do we include them? And I think there is a way, and it doesn't actually have to be complicated. But this is maybe a kind of worms for a later time, but it kind of opens this sort of reconception of organizations more as organizers, to put it in a super rough manner. But that actually coheres with what do we have for organizations now. It certainly does not cohere with the simplicity and kind of limitedness of DAOs, by the way. But that's something that is interesting also for this sort of oxel-like directions. But that's something still in the kind of worms, and a longer topic to visit at some point.
We cannot hear you again.
Probably for the better. I just wanted to say I'm very much up for that thread there.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of interesting possibilities in that direction.
To leave. Bye-bye.
Oh yes, you said you had to leave. Let's. I was meaning to find nice goodbye words, and then I missed them because I'm bad at goodbye. So, like, here's some really great goodbye words.
I got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love you guys. Take care.
See you. See you. See you. But Eva, is there something you want to add about Oxford still, or shall we go to a lightning round of other pebbles or something such?
Let's move on, yeah. Because I think it's just the two of us who were involved. So.
And we can visit that topic also in terms of reflections in whatever context. There's all the pebbles rock through, from the building of a game on a table and a walk. There is the think well. There is the well, we touch upon some of the future directions and some of the other topics. Which pebble would we touch upon first?
I think Martin was catching a pebble or something, throwing it back. I don't know, but we couldn't hear you, yeah, unfortunately.
Now
Yeah,
you're
I don't
actually
now you're muted.
Yes.
Mhm.
Oh, Is it a pebble that you want to keep secret?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you
yes,
hear me?
yes.
I have no pebble to keep secret, but I have a pebble that I'm not yet able to lay out, because it's just not really a pebble. It's more like a
Grains of sand scattered.
it's yeah, thanks, exactly. Like I was going for something more liquid, but somewhere in those terrains. But I'm a bit brooding on something that has very much to do, I mean, with what has come out of our conversations over the last year and a half. But what I just meant to say is, because I'm again, I was completely out of the loop on the Oxford part. If there was a link or so where one could kind of find the recordings to be, that could be super nice.
We don't have them online yet. I can send you the link from the website itself, where the recordings will be at some point. I will do that.
That'd be great. Super. Thank you.
So if I do the think well quickly, then we could have some time for rocks, pebbles, which would be only proper. Like it was actually a, and because maybe it's good for the future anyway. Like to compress it now, but take some of the tailings for the future. Now, it was a very interesting process. Like mostly for the surprisingly positive. I was kind of expecting that it can completely fail or it can succeed, but it actually succeeded better than I thought.
So, hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear
yes,
me?
yes.
So the think well is the thing that we worked on with the movie. Yes, thanks. Check. Super.
So this was, I mean, this there were a couple of challenges. One of was this, like bringing people together, starting from their own ideas and building in 3 days to like some kind of common idea. This part succeeded decently, but that could have been always better. But that was always a challenge that was impossible to assure with design. But it still went actually decently enough. But then, more to the point, what was very, very interesting is that people in rather large groups got the implications. And the implications that because it had this sort of pattern of every situation being designed, but like there was this two principles that I applied towards the design, is that it essentially takes everything that is considered normal from people, like whether it's a question or other kind of expression or their knowledge, backgrounds, etc. But then it takes all of them in as kind of game pieces, roughly speaking. Like that those were the kind of two design principles. Is it doesn't make separate game pieces, but it says like somebody makes a question, they can make it in a normal fashion. So they can bring everything in that they would normally bring. But then where they land and how they move and interact is more in a game structure. And this was kind of like essentially reflected in how it worked. It kept ever changing. Like they became different. For example, questions became different interactions. First building short impressions in one way, then building bonds and knots between people, etc. But towards these implications, what really surprised me that there were several comments after the event, even during the event, that like people got the implication that this means that everything is designable. Like this sort of comments of like this blew the space of where we are and how we process to infinity. Like this, I had two quotes to that effect, and this was kind of for some people even shocking. Like to quote one, there was this one woman that came to one of the organizers and said, "Have you considered that this is dangerous? That this is like opening the culture so much that we don't know the implications." Which I think took like, I understand the danger, but ultimately I took this as a very positive comment, like, because it's about kind of the structures of such kind have power, and every power is always potentially dangerous or not. But it was also like I think for me, like towards XORG, there's sort of okay, maybe there is a way that that these can be communicated easier than one perhaps thinks, and or maybe it's not so hard. The fact that these people got this without telling it, like without underlining it too much, was part of the surprise itself, and also the fact that the reaction was so positive, like that it was this sort of like a. There were comments about this, like, now I have to rethink how I organize my organization, life, etc. There were several of these comments. And I think that's something maybe to reflect in some other session and maybe go through more in detail. But yeah, for me, it was telling about this, like, which is kind of a presence in, or is a presence in all of the things we have done, is that, like, really, whether it's an Oxel or these card structures and so on, they are about ultimately their cultural possibilities. Implications, not just like, okay, you play this game and rest stays the same, but more like, no, this is a game that is a cultural structure, and the more it expands, it in itself proposes something different towards structuring culture. And the fact that people were picking up on this thread without saying that was huge. Like, I think it was huge for um, thinking about the kinds of things we're doing and their viability for the future. That's my short summary of that.
Is there somewhere some material accessible? Because like the entire conversation sounds super interesting.
I think we could go through the model, what worked in what way. Like, I think that's actually the most, because there was no recording. This was a choice. They didn't want to record the whole thing to keep people more open. And then secondly, while they were like separate presentations, the game time was kept, like, it had a structure that was kind of contained presentation like things, but they were more network and small, and they were not like this sort of somebody goes to the stage and speaks for 20 minutes, but actually somebody opening a topic and then people gathering around it, some of them, and because they're interested in a topic, and then dispersing again and gathering somewhere else, which is not really like camera recording. It's just a, once again, a game structure towards presentations. But like, of course, I know the structure, also how it was ultimately used, and like, because of course there were some practical changes and whatnot. So that would be maybe the best way I could imagine going through it. Like here's what happened. Like, here's the structure. Here's what happened. Here's what was strong, weak, interesting, things like this. And I know it, of course, comes out of the abstract, given that it's there or was there in Berlin, etc. But I think precisely for that reason, it might be useful to have like a rundown of the kind of the game structures after. Like, I mean, we had some rundown on the early drafts, but because much of them were XORG influenced. And of course, it's worthy of mentioning, like XORG itself was on the front cover of the program as like a developer towards the structure. It's not the only one, of course, but as one of the developers. No, you're muted again. Is it like a mic connection? Muted, like now it's coming sort of back, but it's no, it's going again. It's maybe a mic connection. Yeah, it's probably like a faulty cable or something. Now you're muted, like oh, maybe it's the faulty Bluetooth then. No, like that was just to package that precisely and leave that for the future, that we would have time for the other pebbles. So we can follow Martin's guideline and move it to like finger rocks pebbles that are still on the table. And maybe it could be a time for Rock to pick the ones that he wants to pick up in the manner he wants to pick them up.
Yeah. Well, the Oxford one kind of, yeah, rang a bell, and also, like, as you were saying, Eva, like about the discussions and we're going on there, like I shared the link to the conference, and that's pretty much all we're gonna talk about there as well, with a bunch of artists present there too. And there's also an online exhibition related to it, and a book that just came out today, actually. Oh no, it's coming out in 5 days, but it was printed today, which can be pre-ordered, etc. Yeah, it's been a big effort in the last few months. The book, the conference, the game as part of the conference. Yeah, I mentioned then, I mean, there's always this possibility, but down the line, kind of making it concrete, like with this thing in Berlin, could be a chance. It's, each time it's played, it's sort of kind of redesigned to fit the situation, right? Yeah, so it's always sort of difficult to get design partners or something, you know, of a kind to continue working on it. So yeah, there could be one open thing. Obviously, like I have these ideas about where it could go in terms of like this game show, not game show type thing that could kind of help the movement in the broadest sense. There's various levels at which we could collaborate. Yeah, I don't know. I guess that's about it. Like, unless, you know, I want to hear some more details on how that works.
I also wanted to ask you, because you picked a particular moment from CCG September.
Yeah.
Why did you pick that? I'm like, I probably would have thought of that, but I'm wanting to hear
your. It was just kind of, you know, kind of lightning strike memory a few days ago. You know, these little things come to you, like, and yeah, just thinking of it, like, I guess that moment kind of stuck with me. And also kind of relating it to the game partially, that was also kind of a method to it, or like you took the Monopoly, you took this faking a game kind of thing, plus, you know, some wacky theory about transformative change and blah, blah, kind of making this this thing, and then the more you design it, the more it designs you back, and so forth. But yeah, it was interesting to kind of take it to that very base of that method itself, and being really aware of it while kind of doing it. Yeah, we had everything from like the hexagon, little labels acting as playing fields, kind of naturally, obviously. We had that almond kind of randomizer situation, like spin the almond thing, and all sorts of kind of fun things.
Yeah, for me, like the one thing to underline from there, I'm also trying to be short, but for me it's a sort of like there is a larger thematic, is like, which kind of touches upon some of the earlier topics, including this think well. It's like, if how society in the widest sense conceives itself turns more and more game-like, or takes more and more influences from these structures. It's something that we cannot know, and we cannot summon with a snap of fingers of how would that look like. It's a much more complicated development that nobody has really a sense of. But I think to entertain those possibilities, like finding these sort of moments where you're essentially like opening a little bit of this curtain, like whether it's in that kind of situation, which was more on the table of, like when we see a hexagon, of course, that is something that is both a representational shape and a game shape. But then also the almond is like, how does it become something else that is like interacting itself rather than just being an almond in traditional sense? And like how does that start to open this insinuations, like foreshadowings, early imaginations of what does it mean for our interactions as a culture? Like that's a kind of like underlying theme why these kind of interactions are interesting. They're interesting, of course, for that. Of course, you can make a game that develops a game. Also that, and that might be also a catalyst towards this kind of change. But all of these things, including this think well, and this is for me like the interesting is to be in this kind of transition state, and being there, kind of looking forwards to roiling chaos and complexity that one cannot really deal with, but then having ways to pick some things out of that future chaos or future complexity, and see something of that, like snapshots. I think there was some of that in that moment.
Yeah, you could say we were like walking on the edge of designers and players, like on one and the other side.
Mm-hmm. And I think all of these things, including the Game Changers event, since those pebbles are now close by, that you roll them around on the table, like are in their own ways kind of touching upon this moment, but or not moment, but here a kind of possibility or direction. But I do think like it's, I think it's something of a, call it the story or call it a description, that I think this group, particularly XORG and everybody connected to it, is getting more able to potentially tell about, like this sort of like, how could you approach such a cultural relation? Not of course in full, but I don't think anybody is. But like if you can open those curtains a bit, like in different points, I think that like telling that or opening that would be in itself valuable. Whether it's in terms of how a situation and objects can turn game-like, and how then the interaction turns from a normal conversation to game-like, or how is it like that people come in, as in the think well, and they're there to discuss real things, but suddenly the real things start moving like game pieces, but that also reveals power. All of these touch upon the same thing, and that's ultimately cultural, at least from my point of view. It's about specific structures, solutions, designs, but it's ultimately all of them have a cultural horizon.
I'm reminded by one specific structure of the game setup that has a lot of parallels with what's been going on in XORG like this. And I've been doing this for the game that we'll be playing in November. Like it's always been this, like when you play it in a specific place with a specific topic, like, you know, art, blockchain, like I would take some, you know, cultural artifacts like books, talks, interviews, these kinds of things, and you would kind of mine that content for game elements, right? In my case, like I have these sort of predefined elements like the challenge cards, the intervention cards, the playing fields themselves that you compete around, which are composed of new economy, buzzwords, and initiatives. And you have like some special corner fields. You have the wild cards, which could be basically anything and have any kind of effect. And then you apply that lens to the text. Like in this case, I was going through the book that we published as part of like this thing. And yeah, there were some really cool ideas kind of that came out of that. And the nice thing was, like, for example, Jeremel in his article was kind of, among many things, like also just talking about this basic fact that everyone in the blockchain space uses Discord, which is, you know, far from like an open source blah blah kind of thing, and coming up with like this wild card of, you know, oh, Discord is down all around the world, right? And you as players, for example, you can't talk with each other when you create a story. Like it's like the person who gets on the field, they're the one who have to create the story, at least until Discord servers are back on, or you actually develop and switch over to an alternative or something. It's interesting how that, yeah, kind of adds to the game, and also adds, you know, even more dimensions or categories to the game that you can then look out for in the next run of mining for this stuff. I mean, that's just something to share, yeah, in my last week's ventures with this game.
And there is a comparison for me between that moment you described and kind of the Thinkwell side. Is like that structure in Thinkwell had a lot of elements that one could recognize as games, like kind of roughly like challenge structures, things like this, like similar to Game Changers and many other games. But then, like it's like when you describe that moment with Yaramil, one of the interesting points in it is that it's not completely outside of processing how things are outside the game in the so-called real world. Like in terms of it's processing how there is this phenomena of how blockchain and particularly DAOs communicate themselves, and like playing that move by Yaramil then makes people process that. So it's not staying in the game, but that is a positive. That in itself is actually kind of making the whole thing richer, because it's bleeding into the game, something that creates considerations that also then bleed out of the game after the game, leaving you thoughts about this topic. And this was something that was very much a kind of feature, like in the Thinkwell games. Well, like from one point, we had these roles, which was actually kind of like acknowledged, kind of started in the XORG design sessions. There was this sort of roles in cards, which were like including blind spotter, which I think was in the XORG session, but also like things like disruptor and concretizer, and like a lot of elephant in the room stater was one, like states the elephant in the room, and there were many of them, but these roles were used to have a quote unquote real conversation, that they had a real problem, but then the roles kept on changing, and how this was then bleeding the game structure into this real conversation, that suddenly, because somebody is a disruptor, they are able to break social bonds, but also like there's a kind of flexibility into the situation that normally does not exist. And then people kind of realizing from that actually that flexibility is something that is very useful. And I think that's an interesting crossover point between what the Game Changers is doing and what that game in Thinkwell is doing. But they all touch upon this, like how, like if the culture would transition to being able to organize itself situation by situation, also entertaining the possibilities of these sort of game structures, how much that potentially could open, which then paints this picture of complexity you cannot really paint as a whole vista of this is how it then would be. But seeing that to me is some kind of a after pebble to throw into the future from this whole throw into the future of XORG.
And there was another idea that came out of the book that kind of connects to the past pebble, like in an article by this Felix Stadler, works at Makery, among other things. It was just this phrase that caught my eye, like the wheel of speculative fortune, like a play on Wheel of Fortune, but with this speculative twist. So yeah, I've got my, corner fields, like, any player that comes on there, like, you invested maybe in some crypto and some NFTs, maybe it's gonna, go up and you can invest in your initiative, or it's gonna go down and you have to sort of let go of an initiative or something. But that was kind of like a moment of, here's a cool line, and then that line itself is kind of the basis for the mechanic, kind of fitting it in.
Mm.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me?
Yes.
Hear me? So nice. I don't know the text you're talking about, Rock, and I'm obviously not in the details of what you're designing there, but I stumbled upon a really, to me, a little bit surprising distinction in the text that or the conversation that was not published for the launch of this Antikythera project by Bratton, and like the kind of follow-up of Stelka. And he distinguishes between a ground truth and a way to take leave of a ground truth. And I would need to kind of dig that back. But you, if I read well what you were just saying, and there's every possibility that I did not, is it comparable, the kind of quote that you just mentioned, that there's kind of some, what did you say, corner?
Like a corner field, yeah, a playing field,
Yeah.
in like a special effect kind of field, like jail is in Monopoly, for example.
Right, but so it wasn't meant to say like there is something like a real world thing, or was it?
I'm not sure in what context he put this wheel of speculative fortune. It's kind of, yeah, a play on words. It's more just it catching my eye, and then I was in the mindset of harvesting some ideas for this specific iteration of the game, because the game itself is all kind of placeholders of specific types of ideas that then you kind of plug in, or you choose from the ones that I've developed or people that have played the game have developed over those play sessions. Oh, you're kind of coming.
Yeah, you're fading out in a. It's a very.
Yeah.
You're not losing anything. It's all good.
It's a very aesthetic experience, but but I think like in a way like it's also general. There's sort of okay, one can call it ground truth, but what if you call it a premise? Uh, like in terms of games, like in game structures, you often set ground truths, but generally they're thought of as a premise because we set them like say before the game starts. This is how things work. And what if those are the same thing? Like of course, in terms of ground truths, there is a lot that comes from the whole of our history, like setting that there is a concept of a chair and like all this conditioning of that we call this thing a house or whatever. But it still kind of behaves like a premise. And so then how do we play with this relation? Like that, the house could have been called something completely different and not even called something, but kind of organized differently, that we would actually call it like household. And then we would rather, every time we see a house, we would think of the organization of it and so on. And then we would think differently. That could have happened, but didn't. So like it's that kind of recognition of a potential playground. And a potential design space. And I think that is interesting in itself. Like it's not it's not that. I think both the kind of truth. It's something that the kind of truth culture and the kind of post-truth culture, like there is no truth, kind of miss, is that there is actually a functionality of sharing, of correlating, of cohesion that comes from the so-called truths, but it's more the basis, the premise that people work upon. And while it's a vast phenomenon in itself, it's still ultimately mostly in kind of within our design capabilities, and reforming or at least modifying some parts of it is a key possibility we have and we don't really use so much as a culture. So yeah, like all of these are, I think, interesting directions. So it's kind of like essentially thinking of taking that relation you just described, Martin, but kind of restating a bit how it forms and how it's thought about.
No.
I think your microphone usually takes like a couple of sentences until it picks up. So maybe just keep on talking and at some point we'll hear you.
We can do a sound level. Every time you start talking, of course, my camera being busted as your microphone, I cannot do the sound level hand sign, which I'm doing here, but now you're muted.
I know. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so nice. I will anyway have to step out. This is
Yeah.
Just to say this, there was this thing like that struck me in that quote, and I mean, I know the way that they've been working also to kind of reconnect materiality, and so they were like that. It was just very clearly about it. It was, but specifically spoke about like some kind of technical observation of natural, environmental change in that domain. And then he was like, that's the kind of, he called that ground truth. And it just struck me in the sense of this kind of this absoluteness in a way. And yeah, that was my question. So like, I understand like the idea of ground truth within the structure that you design. And I understand that that is, by any means inside of what you can design. But it's a kind of, it's a kind of tricky relationship, I think, or like, I don't know if you want to call it tricky. It was just striking to me, the relationship, to say, okay, like, so now how do we bind that back once, you know, once we begin speaking of a ground truth in a kind of, in this natural way?
Well, the one thing I would say towards that, or where you're saying, Eva,
Go ahead.
I'll be short then. Like, the only thing I would say that calling it the ground truth is a designed artificial relation. That word, like that you decide that you put ground truth, is in itself an artificial decision. It doesn't make it any more natural, because calling it natural is also an artificial relation. You decided to call, or somebody decided to call it that. So, like, this is like, in a way, it's still an argument, which makes it a question of design. And that's something, like, it's more expressing a will in a form of design of certain words.
If you can hear me now,
Hmm?
that was exactly the question that I meant to be asking, in reference to Rock's statement there also about the corner fields. I forgot the time. I'm super late. My kids are arriving with the bus, so
Okay.
I better go pick them up. I thank you for the time. I copied that Rock, your quote that you just posted. I copied it and I will read it when I get back. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again next time I have the opportunity. Good evening.
Evening. Okay, let's find a way to closure. But Eva, I heard a noise. Was that a start of a comment that I bluntly overran?
You basically just expressed what I wanted to say, so it was perfectly done.
You would have said it somehow in some other manner, and I've had my own expressions overtly present, but nevertheless, like, but I think that's the, like, maybe my pebble towards the future beyond the pebbles already thrown is like this. Like, I think this whole question of this sort of cultural impact is very interesting for the XORG, but I also think that that question can be faced with actual designs, like actual games, actual structures. It's, of course, it can also be text and so on, but it's kind of wider. It can be like, if you play this game. And the one thing that I maybe leave for later, because it's running long, but I had some really good interactions around the Oxel idea, of which is, by the way, a thing I'm meant to be ending in the Oxford and never really got in time there, which was my mistake. But this sort of like that in itself, like I described for Pablo and Jakub in Berlin, that I think it could be described as a concept with cultural argument, but that its main definition is in the form of a game. That playing the game is how you understand the definition. And I think it works. And that's maybe something later to envision. But yeah, I think, yeah, maybe a short point on that. Like it's this small idea of like how, even like, if you treat any expression as an organizer, like, let's take a super simple one. Like, if I were to say an oxel with a simple sentence defining it, which is all artworks are puzzles. And now in the game of oxel, that means that, okay, this means that every time you meet an artwork, if you enter into that organization, or if you take that organizational element, like you take a pixel into your organization for the moment, or 5 minutes, 1 hour, 1 year, whatever, then you have just in a cascaded fashion change every artwork and your relation to every artwork with one sentence. That you're now looking at puzzles themselves. But then if you add to that, like you say that you have a challenge of creating a review, and you have both of those voxels on, like all artworks are puzzles, and then another model is the challenge is a review, maybe a review in quotation marks. Now it's changed, like you're actually kind of moving in puzzles and you want to write about them. Maybe reviews are in a different form, but that's for you to figure out. And now we are in almost like 1.5 sentences because like challenge, review, quotation marks is barely a sentence. And yet the cascading effect of that change and the modifiability, because we just added 2 modular pieces, we could have one of them or 2 of them, or add a third one. And then being able to switch those on and off to be in this game where the culture constantly keeps on reorganizing itself all the way down to language. Like you can reorganize language through this. Which is a game that has no timeline, has no groups, but has a rather ecosystemic structure, you could say. Like this was a topic I raised with some artists. And like the essential resolution of that was like that there was this understanding that they got that, and like entertaining that as really a game at its heart, but also a kind of cultural proposal is kind of intriguing. That's the teaser direction, I would say, about that.
Nice. I like it.
Yeah, this came from the think well and talking to the artist in there, like this sort of like, how do you create this sort of abyss of possibilities? Isn't it?
I think this would open up like an entire other 2 hours of conversation if we jump on that topic.
But it also opens X hours or X minutes of thinking, which might be also useful.
Mm-hmm. Should we pick a pebble for the future? That would, or one that was supposed to look transcends here and now.
Yeah, I think everybody could pick a pebble for the future, and that would be our ending in their own way. And mark them down so they remember them.
Mm. Well, I think it's well, definitely writing them down, but I think they're all worth exploring. It's just a matter of well, not setting priorities, but like, yeah, collectively deciding what comes when. And I guess it's gonna be pretty emergent depending on who shows up.
Yeah, and I also think that what the future is can be like happening in different places and different time moments. Like, but I think it's now future for all of us here, and then potentially contributing to the future of this group and beyond that.
I think my pebble of the future will be the artificiality of truth. Or that's at least something that struck me just before.
That's a nice one. I make already a hack of it. I call it the necessary artificiality of truth.
Yeah, I like that as well.
No, it's a good one. Yeah. And for me, it's how to put it in words. Like I'm failing in my challenge. I put this moment where, which I've said earlier, but I think it's still a good moment, which is this a person sitting in front of a messy desk and then saying these words to themselves, maybe in their minds, that I have to organize this. And the complete mystery of that, like that, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to organize? What is the choice and where does the choice come from? What is the palette of that? And why is it more a verb than a noun? And why it's maybe a more quote unquote natural, or at least more closer to us as a verb than a noun. And how all of these structures that we have been talking about are kind of new ways of augmenting or assisting that person looking at that desk. Because, you know, the desk could be a world or people or a social group or just a messy desk.
I remember the image you've shown during your presentation.
I think, yes, that's it's a kind of a tarot card. You'll hear about tarot cards later. It's one of these things that we have talked about a lot, but we'll visit that topic again, or rather, probably in the name, under the name of cards in quotation marks, but that's kind of like contains the whole idea of tarot. But I think that's a good ending. It's more like arriving to a cliff, that the cliff is made of time, and so it ends up in a yawning end. But then it's about like standing on the cliff and throwing rocks into the emptiness beyond the cliff.
I like the ambiguity, like with like rocks, and then you hear. Sorry.
Okay, yes, that was mostly unintentional. I could have kept to the pebbles also, but like there's something interesting that there is a representation of rocks, at least in an audible fashion, among us. Because I mean, we're also throwing rocks in addition to ourselves into the future. And with that, any last words? Beyond the rocks, pebbles, and throwing Rocket himself and ourselves into the
Abyss.
yes. If not, let's say goodbye. I will do the ritual that I will now say goodbye to all the potential people that we'll never know and stop the recording.